Welcome, mystery lovers. In this story, we step into the world of Tommy and Tuppence, a pair whose wit and courage have made them unforgettable. Tell us where in the world you're listening from. It's always a joy to see how far these mysteries travel. If you enjoy these mysteries, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps keep new cases coming. Now then, shall we begin? The storm had been threatening all afternoon, and by evening it had broken with a vengeance, lashing the countryside with sheets of rain that rattled the windows of the Beresfords' small sitting room. The clock on the mantelpiece had just struck 7 when the postman, soaked through and muttering darkly about flooded lanes, pressed a letter into Tuppence's hand. She turned it over with her usual curiosity. The envelope was thick, creamy, and embossed with a faded crest, a raven perched upon a hollow branch. Tommy, who had been attempting to light the fire with more enthusiasm than success, straightened at once. "Good heavens," he said, brushing ash from his sleeve. "I'd know that seal anywhere. Reginald Harwood, of all people." "An old flame?" Tuppence asked sweetly, peeling open the flap. "Hardly," Tommy retorted, though a smile tugged at his mouth. "We served together. Harwood was a major then, a devil for chess, and the kind of fellow who always had an extra bottle hidden away when the rations ran low. I haven't seen him in 20 years. Tuppence drew out the heavy vellum sheet and read aloud. "To Thomas Beresford, Esquella and his lady, you are cordially requested, nay, required, to visit Raven's Hollow at your earliest convenience. Matters of grave importance compel me to summon old allies. Time presses. Yours, Reginald Harwood." She let the letter fall to her lap. "Well, that sounds more like a summons than an invitation." Tommy paced to the window. Beyond the glass, lightning split the sky, illuminating the drenched hedgerows, and the village green turned to mud. "That's Reginald all over. Always did enjoy a touch of melodrama. Still, if he says it's important, it must be. And Raven's Hollow." He hesitated. "It's said to be a rather forbidding place." "Delightful," said Tuppence briskly. "I've always fancied a Gothic weekend. Pack the motorcoats, we're going." The following afternoon found them battling the storm once more, their little motorcar crawling up the rutted lane that led to the Harwood estate. The countryside rolled away in a bleak procession of sodden fields and twisted oaks. At last, the silhouette of Raven's Hollow appeared, a brooding manor of stone, its turrets clawing at the sky, ivy strangling its walls. A lantern swung in the wind above the gate, its light casting wild shadows on the rain-slicked drive. Tuppence shivered with theatrical relish. "All we need now is a wolf baying at the moon." "Don't tempt fate," Tommy muttered, guiding the car through iron gates that creaked like something alive. At the great oak door a butler awaited them. Tall and severe, his expression betrayed nothing, but the way his eyes darted toward the storm suggested unease. He relieved them of their coats with a bow and ushered them inside. The hall was cavernous, its beams blackened with age, and tapestries sagged against the walls. A fire roared in the hearth, though it seemed to provide little warmth. On a long table rested several travelling cases, evidence of other guests recently arrived. "Sir Reginald awaits you in the dining room," the butler intoned. The gathering was already assembled when the Beresfords entered. At the head of the table sat Sir Reginald himself, older, heavier, his once dark hair now silver, but the eyes the same, sharp, restless, and faintly mocking. He rose with surprising agility and clasped Tommy's hand. "Beresford, my boy, and Mrs. Beresford, a pleasure. Forgive the dramatics, but I find myself in need of allies I can trust." "You flatter us," Tuppence said lightly, taking in the room. The other guests regarded them with varying degrees of interest. At Reginald's right sat a thin young man, perhaps in his late 20s, whose restless fingers tapped the stem of his wineglass. He was introduced as Henry Harwood, Reginald's nephew, pale, ambitious, with the faintly desperate air of a man who had too often dreamed of fortunes not yet his. Beside him was Mr. Charles Linton, the secretary, nervous, bespectacled, and already perspiring despite the chill in the room. He avoided eye contact, preferring to study his plate as though it contained the solution to some pressing problem. Across from them sat Lady Eleanor Ashcombe, a widow of imposing figure swathed in jet beads. She possessed the sort of beauty that clung fiercely to its last vestiges, her smile too practised, her laughter too sudden. Finally, there was the Reverend Pritchard, vicar of the local parish. His kindly manner seemed genuine, yet his eyes darted away whenever money or land was mentioned. His fingernails were ink-stained, as if from long hours with accounts rather than sermons. Dinner commenced, though dinner was perhaps too generous a term. The food was sparse, the wine plentiful. Conversation flickered like the candles, each remark casting its own shadow. "You've come at a troubled time," Reginald declared, his voice booming against the panelled walls. "Ravenshollow has seen better days, but it still holds secrets. Some," his eyes travelled over the table, lingering on each guest in turn, "that will not stay buried." Henry shifted uneasily, spilling a few drops of wine. Lady Eleanor arched an eyebrow, amused. The secretary dabbed at his forehead, and the vicar coughed into his napkin. Tuppence leaned toward Tommy and whispered, "Do you feel as though we've walked into the middle of a play, and no one will give us the script?" He gave a faint nod. "Let's hope it's not a tragedy." As the storm rattled the windows and thunder boomed, Reginald rose for a final toast. His hand trembled slightly as he raised his glass. "To secrets buried deep," he intoned, "and to those brave enough to dig them up." The words hung in the air like smoke. No one drank. Tuppence, ever the observer, noticed the secretary's quick glance toward the door, the nephew's tightening jaw, the widow's faint smile as though she relished the drama, and the vicar's muttered prayer under his breath. The fire cracked, shadows leapt across the ancient beams, and the storm howled outside. In that moment, Tuppence felt the chill of foreboding settle in her bones. Whatever had drawn them to Ravenshollow, it was no simple reunion. It was the beginning of something darker, and she knew instinctively that before the storm had passed, one of those faces around the table would be marked by tragedy. The butler cleared his throat. "Shall I bring dessert, sir?" Reginald shook his head. "No dessert tonight. We've more pressing matters to discuss. But tomorrow, perhaps. Tomorrow may bring revelations." With that, he sank back into his chair, the flames casting his face in stark relief, half in light, half in shadow. And somewhere deep within the manor, a clock began to chime the hour, each note echoing through the hollow halls like the toll of fate. The great dining room of Ravenshollow seemed to hold its breath as the guests settled into their places. Candlelight flickered from twin candelabra, throwing long shadows against the carved oak panels. The storm outside had gathered strength, rain hammering at the mullioned windows and wind howling down the chimneys as though the house itself objected to their presence. Tommy and Tuppence took their seats midway down the long table, placed neatly between Lady Eleanor's perfumed hauteur and the Reverend Pritchard's earnest coughs. At the head, Sir Reginald presided like some weary monarch of a dwindling realm, his face half-lit, half-shadowed, eyes sharp despite his years. Dinner began with a consommé served in fragile china bowls. The butler moved silently between the chairs, his expression unreadable. Conversation flickered uncertainly, as though each guest measured their words before releasing them into the charged air. "So," Lady Eleanor said, stirring her soup with languid grace, "our host has assembled quite the party. A curious mixture, don't you think?" Henry Harwood's fingers resumed their restless tapping against the table. "Families gather for all sorts of reasons, Lady Eleanor. Some pleasant, some less so." His uncle shot him a glance that carried both amusement and warning. "Indeed, families, old friends, and those who prefer the title of guest to accomplice." A silence followed. Tuppence, tilting her head with apparent innocence, observed the secretary, Mr. Linton. The man's spoon rattled faintly against the china, his hand unsteady. She noticed a small brass key dangling from a chain at his waistcoat, slipping in and out of view as though he had forgotten, or feared, to keep it hidden. Tommy caught her glance and arched an eyebrow. She smiled sweetly at him, but her eyes sparkled. A clue. The second course arrived, pigeon pie, rich and savoury, though half of it went untouched. The wind rattled the windows hard enough to set the glass trembling. The vicar muttered a brief prayer about shelter in storms, though whether he referred to the weather or something near at hand was unclear. "You've not explained," Henry said suddenly, turning to his uncle, "why we're here at all. Letters delivered in storms. Talk of pressing matters. Surely you don't mean to keep us guessing forever." Sir Reginald leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Patience, my boy. All in good time. For now, let us enjoy our supper." but no one enjoyed it. The tension thickened like the sauce over the roasted pheasant. When the third course was served, steamed sole with capers, Tommy attempted to ease the mood. "A fine house you keep, Sir Reginald, and quite the collection of guests. You might almost be staging a play." The remark drew a brittle laugh from Lady Eleanor. "And what roles do we play, I wonder? Hero, villain, ingenue, or victim?" The words hung uncomfortably. Mr. Linton dropped his fork with a clatter, then bent swiftly to retrieve it. As he did, Tuppence noticed a draught stir the candles nearest the wall. She followed the movement with narrowed eyes. Behind the tapestry, the faint outline of a concealed door shivered. Curious. Conversation resumed in fits and starts. The vicar spoke earnestly about repairs needed at the parish roof, only to be met with Henry's sarcastic quip about misplaced priorities. Lady Eleanor regaled them with an anecdote about a ball at Bath, yet her laughter had a brittle edge. And Reginald himself, always circling, never settling, dropped hints like breadcrumbs: betrayal, reckoning, debts unpaid. "Life has a way," he said at last, glass in hand, "of bringing accounts to order. Sooner or later the balance must be struck." A crash of thunder punctuated his words. The candles guttered, then flared again, shadows darting across the stone hearth like spectres. Tuppence leaned close to Tommy. "Notice Henry's temper, the vicar's nerves. And Linton, he's sweating over more than the soup. There are secrets here, Tommy." "Plenty," he murmured back, "but not the sort one shares over pheasant." Dessert was served, treacle pudding, sticky and rich, but few touched it. Conversation had curdled into bickering. Henry accused Lady Eleanor of chasing Harwood fortune through amiable company. She, in turn, hinted at the young man's gambling debts, her words as sharp as broken glass. The vicar attempted to mediate, only to be accused himself of begging favours from the family purse. Reginald watched it all with a grim satisfaction, like a man watching his own stage play unfold. "So spirited," he said softly, "so revealing." Then, with deliberate slowness, he rose to his feet. The room quieted. All eyes turned to him. He raised his glass, though his hand trembled faintly in the candlelight. "To secrets buried deep," he said, his voice carrying above the storm, "and to those brave enough to dig them up." The words echoed against the panelled walls. Lightning split the sky, illuminating every face at the table. Henry's pale defiance, Linton's sweat-beaded fear, Lady Eleanor's gleam of amusement, the vicar's whispered prayer, Tommy's keen alertness, Tuppence's quiet resolve. The thunder that followed shook the house to its foundations. No one spoke, no one drank. And in the silence that followed, it seemed as though Raven's Hollow itself listened, waiting. Morning broke grudgingly over Raven's Hollow, the storm spent but leaving behind a sky the colour of tarnished pewter. The rain had ceased in the small hours, yet the lawns lay drowned and the gravel drive gleamed like a wet blade. The house, ancient and brooding, seemed to resent the arrival of daylight, its stone walls slick with damp, its windows dull with condensation. Tuppence descended the staircase with a shawl wrapped about her shoulders, her eyes sharp despite the late night. Tommy followed, tugging at his tie with habitual impatience. They had agreed to breakfast promptly at 9, though both suspected Sir Reginald would summon them to further disclosures. But the breakfast room was empty. A single silver pot of coffee stood cooling, the bacon congealed upon its platter. The butler hovered by the door, his composure strained. "Sir Reginald is not accustomed to tardiness," Tuppence remarked lightly. The butler bowed his head. "His lordship has not yet appeared." At that moment Henry Harwood entered, pale and irritable, his hair uncombed. "What's this? No uncle at table? That's unheard of." Lady Eleanor drifted in soon after, swathed in a dressing gown of plum silk, her voice husky with too little sleep. "Perhaps the storm unsettled him. I confess I heard footsteps long after midnight." Her remark drew a look from Mr. Linton, the secretary, who clutched a bundle of papers as though for comfort. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and sank into a chair. The Reverend Pritchard, last to arrive, muttered a prayer of thanks over the cold bacon, his eyes downcast. It was then that the butler cleared his throat. "If you would excuse me, I shall inquire of Sir Reginald." He left, and silence closed about the table. Every tick of the clock seemed to echo. Tuppence exchanged a glance with Tommy. Something was amiss. The cry came minutes later, a strangled sound that tore through the hushed corridors. Chairs scraped back, and the guests hurried after the butler, who stood rigid before the heavy door of the study. "It is locked," he gasped. Henry thrust past him and rattled the handle. "Uncle, do you hear me? Open at once." No reply. Only silence. Tommy stepped forward. "Key?" The butler's hands shook as he produced it. The lock turned with a reluctant groan and the door swung inward. The scene beyond arrested them all. Sir Reginald sat slumped in his high-backed chair behind the vast mahogany desk. A pistol lay upon the carpet, its barrel glinting dully. The safe behind him stood open, papers spilling out like entrails. The air reeked faintly of cordite and ink. Lady Eleanor pressed a hand to her throat. Merciful heavens! Henry staggered back, his face bloodless. No, no, it cannot. Mr. Linton gave a strangled sob, then choked it down. The vicar murmured a broken prayer. Tuppence advanced cautiously, her eyes darting from desk to floor, from clock to window. She knelt beside the fallen pistol. "Left hand," she murmured. Tommy frowned. "What's that?" "Sir Reginald was right-handed," she said crisply. "I noticed last night at dinner when he raised his glass." Indeed, the weapon lay by his left hand, though the angle seemed unnatural. Tommy stooped to examine the desk. "And look here, the ink. Still wet, yet the paper torn. Someone wished us to think he left a note." Tuppence pointed toward the mantel. "And the clock, Tommy. Stopped at midnight, yet it is wound. Curious, don't you think?" He nodded grimly. "Staged." Henry knelt beside the body, grief and desperation mingled in his expression. Surely it was suicide. Uncle had grown strange of late, brooding, secretive. Lady Eleanor's lips curled faintly. "Or perhaps you think so because it serves your interest, Henry. Inheritance is such a persuasive argument." Henry leapt to his feet. "You dare—" Tommy interposed himself. "That will do. Whether suicide or murder, the truth will out. But mark me, this room has been arranged. Sir Reginald did not end his life of his own accord." The secretary moaned softly, clutching his papers tighter. He said there would be a reckoning. Last night he spoke of accounts. Oh, why did I not persuade him to burn those ledgers?" He bit his tongue, but the words had already spilled. Tuppence's eyes narrowed. "Ledgers?" Mr. Linton stammered. Nothing of import, only records." "Which someone," Tommy said, glancing at the gaping safe, "was eager to obtain." The vicar cleared his throat, his face pinched. "Surely we ought to summon the authorities at once. This is no matter for amateurs." "Quite right," Lady Eleanor said smoothly, though her gaze lingered on the open safe. "The sooner the police come, the better." But Tuppence's mind was elsewhere. She recalled the muffled footsteps she had heard in the corridor after midnight, long after the guests had retired. She had dismissed them at the time, assuming some servant about late duties. Now, in the chill of the study, with Reginald's lifeless form before her, the memory sharpened into menace. Someone had been moving about. Someone had come here. The butler, still pale, ventured, "The key was turned from within, madam. I assure you the door was locked." "Which makes it all the more convenient," Tommy said grimly. "A locked room, a pistol, an open safe. It fairly screams of suicide. And yet—" He lifted the torn paper from the desk. "Why rip this? Why not leave it intact if the old man wished to confess?" Tuppence glanced at the safe. Among the scattered documents, one lay half-burned, its edges blackened as though someone had attempted to destroy it hastily. She plucked it free. Evidence of a hurried hand. If Sir Reginald meant to die, why bother with such untidiness? She turned to the others. No, this was staged. He was silenced before he could reveal whatever truth pressed upon him. A collective shiver ran through the room. The storm outside had quieted, but within Raven's Hollow the true storm was only beginning. The police were sent for, though the nearest inspector would take hours to arrive. In the meantime, the household was in turmoil. Henry paced like a caged animal. Lady Eleanor sipped brandy with unnerving calm. The secretary fidgeted and muttered, and the vicar prayed ceaselessly. Tuppence and Tommy remained in the study, sifting through the details. "Notice," Tuppence whispered, The smudge of mud by the threshold. Fresh, damp. Someone came from outside before dawn. Tommy nodded. And the window latch loosened. The door may have been locked, but the window was another matter. They exchanged a glance. Whoever had killed Sir Reginald had planned carefully, yet not carefully enough. Tommy straightened, his jaw set. This was no act of despair. It was murder, and coldly executed. The question is, who among us feared Reginald's revelations enough to kill? Tuppence's gaze swept over the room. The pistol in the wrong hand, the stopped clock, the torn paper, the open safe. Clues scattered like breadcrumbs, yet pointing not outward, but inward, toward the very table at which they had supped the night before. Her voice was soft, but it carried conviction. One of them, Tommy. One of them silenced him, and until we know which, we are all in danger. The housekeeper entered timidly with word that Inspector Graves would arrive before dusk. Her voice trembled as she asked whether she ought to cover the body. No, Tommy said firmly. Let nothing be disturbed. The inspector must see it as we have. Yet even as he spoke, the shadows in the corners of the study seemed to deepen, as though the old house itself wished to conceal its secrets. And in the echo of the stopped clock, its hands frozen forever at midnight, the Beresfords felt the chill certainty settle upon them. Sir Reginald Harwood had not died by his own hand. He had been silenced, deliberately, ruthlessly, by someone seated at last night's table, and the reckoning he had promised was only just beginning. The corridors of Raven's Hollow seemed colder that afternoon, though the hearths had been stoked and lamps lit against the murk of a rain-heavy sky. Sir Reginald's body remained in the study, guarded by the butler's solemn presence until the police arrived, yet the air of waiting was unbearable. Secrets pressed at the very walls, and Tommy and Tuppence knew the time for polite observation had passed. They began their inquiries quietly, moving from guest to guest, then to the household staff. It was less an interrogation than a series of conversations, each revealing fragments of truth, half-truths, and carefully guarded lies. Henry Harwood was first. They found him pacing the library, his face drawn, his movements jerky as though his very bones rattled with nerves. "You must see it," he burst out before Tommy could speak. "It was suicide. My uncle, he grew morose, withdrawn. He spoke of debts, betrayals. He could not endure." "Or perhaps," Tuppence suggested, her tone mild, "he spoke of others' debts, others' betrayals, not his own." Henry flushed. "You mean to suggest, what, that I had a hand? Rubbish. Yes, I have obligations. Who doesn't? But would I kill my own uncle, the only man standing between me and complete financial ruin?" "Some might call that motive," Tommy said evenly. "But tell me, where were you last night at midnight?" Henry's jaw tightened. "In my room, alone, which, I imagine, is no alibi at all." "No," Tuppence said softly, "but it is honest enough to be suspicious." He glared at her, then turned away, muttering about vultures and accusations. Mr. Linton, the secretary, proved no less evasive. They found him in a small office off the hall, surrounded by stacks of ledgers and correspondence. His spectacles slid down his nose, and his hands fluttered nervously over the papers as though shielding them. "Sir Reginald relied on me for everything," he said, voice tremulous. "I was his right hand, yet he never gave me the respect I deserved. Do you know, last month he threatened to replace me, after all my years of service." "Resentment is a dangerous seed," Tommy said, leaning against the desk. "Did you ever think of uprooting it, permanently?" The secretary's hands shook so violently the papers scattered. "No, never. Yes, I was angry, but anger is not murder. You must believe me. I heard nothing, saw nothing, only this morning when the butler raised the alarm." "Not quite true," Tuppence interrupted. Her eyes were keen. "Last night, during supper, you clutched at a key you wore on a chain. What did it open, Mr. Linton?" His mouth opened, closed. "Merely a filing cabinet, nothing more." But the tremor in his voice said otherwise. Lady Eleanor received them in her chamber, already dressed as though for an evening gala rather than a house under shadow. She reclined on a chaise, a cigarette held languidly between two jewelled fingers. "Really," she drawled, "must we play at detectives? The police will arrive soon enough. In the meantime, oughtn't we occupy ourselves with something less dreary than suspicion? Your connection to Sir Reginald was what, precisely? Tuppence asked. The widow smiled faintly. Old friends, occasional companions in boredom. He admired my company, I admired his cellar. Beyond that, very little. And yet you rushed to accept his invitation, Tommy noted. Her eyes glittered. I am a widow, Mr. Beresford. A woman learns to cultivate invitations, particularly from men of property. If there was more to it, perhaps Sir Reginald hoped. I did not. Tuppence studied her. The jewels at her throat, though ostentatious, were paste. Her perfume was heavy, masking something faintly acrid. A lady of means, perhaps, or perhaps not. When asked about the night before, Lady Eleanor shrugged. I slept poorly. Storms disturbed me. At one point I thought I heard raised voices in the corridor, but I assumed it was servants, hardly the stuff of alibis. Her laughter was brittle, as though daring them to call it false. The Reverend Pritchard welcomed them into the small anteroom where he had taken refuge, a Bible clutched tightly in his ink-stained hands. He looked older than the night before, his shoulders bowed, his eyes haunted. A tragedy, he murmured, a terrible tragedy. Sir Reginald was a pillar of our parish. Flawed, yes, but generous when he chose to be. When he chose, Tommy repeated. And when he did not. The vicar flushed. There were times, debts incurred by the church roof, charitable accounts. I pressed him for aid. He turned me away. But such matters are not reason to... He broke off, his voice cracking. Tuppence watched him closely. You heard nothing in the night? The vicar hesitated. His lips formed words, then closed again. At last he said, I prayed until late. The storm masked all else. Yet his eyes, darting away, betrayed knowledge untold. The household staff proved no less illuminating. In hushed voices they whispered of quarrels behind closed doors, of Sir Reginald's temper, and, most intriguingly, of his black book. A ledger, madam, the housekeeper confided, her voice trembling. Names, dates, sums. Sir Reginald kept it hidden, but we servants hear things. Some say it held evidence of wicked dealings, debts owed, favours bought. Tuppence felt a chill. A black book. Perhaps the very records Linton feared. Perhaps the motive that bound them all. In the scullery she noticed a pair of boots drying by the fire. Mud clung thick upon the soles, fresh from the sodden grounds, yet none of the servants admitted to venturing out during the storm. By the side entrance she bent to retrieve a small object half hidden in the rushes. A broken cuff-link, plain silver, its surface scratched. She slipped it into her pocket without a word, and in the library fireplace she discovered ashes too recent, too deliberate. Among them, charred scraps of paper bore traces of ink, accounts perhaps, or names. Someone had attempted to destroy evidence before dawn. That evening, Tommy and Tuppence reconvened in the drawing-room, the storm returning in a low growl beyond the windows. Well? Tommy asked, hands clasped behind his back. What have we? Tuppence drew out the cuff-link and set it upon the mantel. A broken token, a pair of muddy boots, a fire used to consume secrets, and above all, fear. Every one of them hides something. Tommy nodded slowly. Henry, desperate for money. Linton, resentful and furtive. Eleanor, with her vanishing fortune. The vicar, drowning in debts. And the servants, whispering of a black book. She leaned toward him. Red herrings, Tommy. Some, perhaps, but among them swims the truth, and the truth killed Sir Reginald. They fell silent, listening to the wind rattle the windows. Shadows lengthened across the room, merging with the corners, as though the house itself conspired to conceal its secrets. Suspects and shadows, Tommy said at last, his voice grim. And we'll have to separate the two before the killer strikes again. The rain had ceased for a time, though the sky above Raven's Hollow remained heavy and low, as though pressing upon the ancient stones of the house. Inside, the atmosphere was thicker still. The discovery of Sir Reginald's body had cast its pall over every corridor, and whispers moved as restlessly as the draughts that curled along the passages. It was late afternoon when Tuppence, ever curious and never still, made her way once more to the library. The fire there was nearly out, reduced to a red glow and a trickle of smoke. She stirred the embers with the poker, and in so doing uncovered fragments of paper that had not been consumed entirely. Charred edges crumbled at her touch, but the centers remained intact enough to reveal columns of writing, names, dates, figures. "Tommy," she called quietly. He entered a moment later, shutting the door against the restless murmurs of the household. His brow furrowed as she laid the scorched remains upon the desk. "Half burned," she said, too hurried to finish the job. "Look here, see these notations? Not ordinary accounts. This was no household ledger." Tommy leaned over, his military-trained eye scanning the careful, compact script. "Ciphers," he muttered. "Abbreviations, initials, dates, almost like field codes, but here, numbers, sums of money, not rations or stores, transactions." "Blackmail," Tuppence suggested. He looked at her gravely. "Or worse, wartime secrets. Harwood was in intelligence during the war. He knew things. If he kept records of men who betrayed trust or profited when they ought not, then that book would be dangerous indeed," she finished, "and worth killing for." They spread the fragments carefully, piecing them together as best they could. Names appeared, though often reduced to initials. One fragment bore the notation E.A., June 42, 5,000. Another, C.L., files withheld, urgent. Tuppence's eyes narrowed. E.A. Eleanor Ashcombe, C.L. Charles Linton, the secretary. Tommy exhaled slowly. "Too neat to be coincidence, but we mustn't leap. Initials can mislead." Still, the implications were damning. Each guest at Raven's Hollow seemed already suspicious. Now, with the ledger pointing fingers in coded ink, the shadows around them deepened. The corridors by evening were lit with wavering candles, their flames guttering whenever a door opened. The house felt like a trap. Every turning revealed another shadow, another face half hidden by gloom. Tuppence carried the fragments in a folio, her step purposeful. She caught Henry Harwood at the stair, his eyes red-rimmed, his mouth set. "What have you there?" he demanded a little too sharply. "Some of your uncle's papers," she replied coolly. "Rescued from the fire." His gaze flickered. "Best leave them to the police." "Best let them vanish, you mean," she countered. "What might they reveal, Mr. Harwood?" He bristled. "Nothing of me. I've no secrets worth writing down. But my uncle, he had a way of inventing enemies. Perhaps you'd do well not to take his scribblings at face value." He swept past, though the tremor in his hands betrayed him. Later, in the drawing-room, Lady Eleanor held court before the fire, cigarette smoke curling above her like a veil. Tuppence, ever direct, showed her one fragment marked E.A. "Do these initials trouble you, Lady Eleanor?" The widow laughed, low and amused. "My dear, if every E.A. were mine, I should be far busier than I am. 5,000. What currency? What year? A widow meets many gentlemen. Some leave gifts, some leave gossip. Your fragment proves nothing." Yet her smile was too bright, her fingers tightening on the cigarette holder until it trembled. The secretary, Charles Linton, proved no calmer. Confronted with his initials in the ledger, he turned chalk white. "Files withheld," Tuppence repeated softly. "Urgent?" Linton stammered. I don't know what it means. Perhaps I misplaced something once during the war." So Reginald kept meticulous notes. He could twist the smallest failing into leverage. "Leverage," Tommy said, watching him. "Or blackmail." The secretary shook his head violently. "I served faithfully. If he wrote such a thing, it was spite, nothing more." But the way his hands clutched at the desk told a different story. The Reverend Pritchard, too, reacted strangely. When Tuppence hinted at a book of names, his prayer book slipped from his fingers, falling with a thud. He retrieved it quickly, but colour rose in his cheeks. "We are all sinners," he murmured. "Who among us could bear a full accounting of our deeds?" "Yet some sins cost more than others," Tommy observed, "and some men would pay dearly to keep them hidden." The vicar's lips moved silently, as though in prayer, but his eyes refused to meet theirs. By the time the guests gathered again for supper, the atmosphere was taut as wire. Every glance was weighted, every remark sharpened. The candles burned low, dripping wax like tears. Tuppence noted how Lady Eleanor watched Henry with faint contempt, how Henry avoided the secretary's gaze, how the vicar's hands shook as he lifted his wine. Shadows clung to the corners of the room as though listening. Tommy leaned close to her. Reginald said it himself, betrayal and reckoning. He meant this book. He meant to expose someone, and someone struck first. She nodded, her eyes restless, marking every twitch and flinch. The question is, who most feared exposure, and who had the courage or desperation to kill? Later, alone in the library once more, they pieced through the fragments again. The fire had burned down entirely, leaving only ash and a faint glow. The silence of the house was immense. Tommy spread the papers in order. Look, patterns. Each entry links a name to a transaction. Payments, files, services rendered. Not just debts, secrets sold. This was a record of betrayal, Tuppence. During the war, men who should have stood firm instead lined their pockets, she finished grimly. And Sir Reginald knew. Her fingers touched one fragment, the ink still visible despite the char. This was enough to ruin reputations, enough to send men to prison, perhaps worse. Tommy sat back, his face grim in the candlelight. So who among them could risk discovery least? Henry, desperate for funds. Linton, bound by resentment. Eleanor, whose fortune may not be all she claims. Pritchard, drowning in debts. Each name in this book is a chain around its owner's neck. Harwood only had to pull. Tuppence's eyes glittered, and someone chose to cut the rope by cutting his life. A board creaked outside the door. They turned sharply. A shadow flitted past the frosted glass panel. Tommy strode to the door and flung it open. The corridor was empty, candle flames swaying in a draught. "Someone listening," he muttered. Tuppence gathered the fragments swiftly, slipping them into the folio. "Then we are close, Tommy, close enough that the killer grows nervous." She cast one last glance around the library, the shelves looming like mute witnesses, the air thick with smoke and suspicion. "Raven's Hollow is no longer merely a house of mourning," she said softly. "It has become a snare, and we are all caught within its net." They retired late, but sleep did not come easily. The house groaned in the night, as though restless with secrets. From time to time, footsteps echoed faintly in the corridors, too soft to place, too deliberate to be accident. Tuppence lay awake, the folio of fragments beneath her pillow, her mind turning over every word, every glance, every shadow. Somewhere among them lay the truth. Somewhere in the charred remains of Sir Reginald's ledger was the name of a killer. And until it was revealed, Raven's Hollow would remain a place of dread, where each face by candlelight might mask a murderer's heart. The grandfather clock in the great hall had just tolled the hour of midnight when Tuppence stirred in her bed. Sleep had evaded her from the moment she extinguished the lamp. The silence of Raven's Hollow was not the silence of peace, but of a house holding its breath, an uneasy quiet broken only by the creak of ancient timbers and the sigh of wind probing the cracks in the shutters. She had almost persuaded herself to drift into dreams when a sound pulled her upright. A floorboard groaned, too heavy for settling wood. Then another. Someone was moving along the passage. Barefoot, she slipped from the bed, drawing a shawl about her shoulders. Tommy murmured in his sleep, but she pressed a finger to her lips, though he could not see, and eased open the door. The corridor lay in darkness save for a single candle guttering on a side table. Its flame quivered as if in warning. Tuppence's eyes narrowed. Down the length of the hall a shadow shifted, soundless but distinct, the outline of a cloaked figure gliding toward the stair. Her pulse quickened, yet she moved lightly, her slippered feet making no sound on the carpet runner. She followed, careful to remain at a distance. The figure descended, pausing once to glance back. Tuppence shrank into an alcove, holding her breath. The hood of the cloak concealed the intruder's face, but the gesture, the sharp turn of the head, the nervous tension of the shoulders, spoke of someone afraid of discovery. At the foot of the stair, the figure crossed the hall, the hem of the cloak brushing the marble tiles, and slipped into the library. Tuppence hesitated only a moment before following. The library loomed before her like a cavern, its high shelves rising into darkness, the dying fire casting faint glows. She pressed herself against the doorframe, peering in. The cloaked intruder had gone straight to the desk, the same heavy piece where Tommy and she had examined the charred remains of Sir Reginald's ledger. Drawers slid open, papers shuffled in feverish haste. The figure leaned close, rifling through parchments, discarding some to the floor. Tuppence's heart hammered. Whoever it was, they sought something Reginald had left behind, something the burning of the ledger had not erased. She edged forward, careful of the boards, yet a misstep betrayed her, a faint creak beneath her slipper. The figure froze, then, with a sudden movement, turned toward the door. Tuppence caught only a glimpse of eyes glinting in the shadow of the hood before she darted behind the tall globe in the corner. Silence. She held her breath, every muscle taut. The intruder lingered a moment longer, then bent quickly, seizing a single scrap of parchment from the desk. The cloak swirled as the figure vanished through the side door leading to the servants' passage. Tuppence exhaled. The pounding of her heart echoed in her ears. She moved swiftly to the desk. Papers lay scattered, drawers left half open, but among the disorder one piece remained pinned beneath the heavy inkwell. A torn scrap, browned with age, bore a fragment of writing in Reginald's hand. "The hollow hour strikes." Tuppence shivered. The phrase was eerie, cryptic, and unfinished. She wasted no time. Gathering the scrap, she hurried upstairs to wake Tommy. He blinked blearily as she shook him, but when she told him what she had seen, his sleepiness vanished. "You followed them? Alone?" he demanded, swinging his legs from the bed. "I wasn't about to let the opportunity pass," she replied. "Besides, they nearly caught me. Whoever it was, they moved with purpose, and they wanted this." She handed him the parchment. Tommy held it to the lamplight, his brows knitting. "The hollow hour strikes. Sounds like the beginning of a riddle." "Or a message left for us to find," Tuppence said. "Reginald's last words, perhaps? If he suspected he'd be silenced, he might have hidden clues in fragments." Tommy frowned. "Which means the killer knows the fragments exist, and if they don't find them first, they may try again." Tuppence touched his arm. "Then we had best be quicker than they are." Sleep was out of the question after that. By the hour of 1, Tommy and Tuppence were dressed and moving silently through the house. The library still bore the marks of intrusion, the displaced papers, the open drawers, the faint smell of candle wax lingering in the air. Tommy crouched by the desk. No signs of forced entry. Whoever it was had a key, or knew the servants' ways. The cloak, Tuppence mused, too large to be ordinary livery. It looked deliberate, meant to conceal. They searched the room thoroughly, but beyond the parchment scrap nothing new presented itself. Still, the sense of menace lingered. As they emerged into the hall, the grandfather clock chimed the quarter hour, its tones heavy and solemn. Tuppence glanced at it thoughtfully. "The hollow hour," she murmured. "Do you suppose it refers to the clock?" "Or to this house," Tommy said. "Raven's Hollow. Words can wear two coats, Tuppence. Harwood was fond of riddles, I recall." Their whispered speculation was interrupted by a sound, a faint rustle from the landing above. They turned, candlelight glinting off polished banisters. Henry Harwood appeared, dishevelled, his dressing gown hanging loosely. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "Prowling at this hour? Have we sunk to burglaries now?" Tommy's expression was unreadable. "We might ask the same. Couldn't sleep?" Henry's eyes flicked toward the library door, then away. "I heard noises. Thought perhaps the servants." "Convenient," Tuppence said softly. Henry flushed. "If you mean to accuse me, say so outright. Otherwise, let me return to my bed." He turned sharply and ascended, his footsteps too hurried for composure. Tuppence and Tommy exchanged a glance. Another suspect in the night. They were not alone in their nocturnal wanderings. As they passed toward the back stair, they nearly collided with Mr. Linton, the secretary, who clutched a candle in one shaking hand. His face gleamed with sweat, his spectacles fogged. "Terrible business," he stammered. "The storm unsettles me. I could not rest." "Storm's long gone," Tommy remarked. "It isn't the weather that keeps you awake." The secretary's eyes darted. "You think me guilty, but I swear I've done nothing. I feared burglars, that's all." "And you thought to defend the library's contents yourself?" Tuppence asked. Linton's mouth opened, closed. He muttered something about duty and scurried off, leaving behind the faint odour of extinguished candle smoke. By 2 o'clock the house seemed to sink into silence again, yet that silence was deceptive, for suspicion now threaded through every corner. They returned to their chamber, but Tommy remained at the desk, the parchment scrap before him. "The hollow hour strikes," he repeated. "If it refers to the clock, then midnight would be the moment. Reginald died around midnight according to the stopped hands. Could he have meant to signal something specific about the time? Or, Tuppence suggested, about the place, Raven's Hollow itself striking back at those who betrayed it, a kind of poetic justice. Tommy smiled faintly. You'd make a fine poet, Tuppence, but I'll settle for a clue that leads us to the killer. She yawned, drawing the shawl closer. Then we must hold tight to every fragment. Our intruder won't stop until they have them all. The following morning, the household gathered for breakfast under a sky washed pale by reluctant sun. Faces were drawn, tempers frayed. Lady Eleanor sipped her coffee with exaggerated calm. Henry stared into his plate, unshaven. The vicar's eyes were red from wakefulness, his lips moving silently in prayer. Linton's hands shook so violently that his cup rattled against its saucer. Tuppence watched them all, the torn scrap of parchment folded safely in her pocket. "An intruder walked the halls last night," she announced suddenly, her voice carrying. Every head turned. Henry's fork clattered. Eleanor's brows arched. Linton went pale. Tommy added, "They entered the library, searched the desk, and left in haste. We have proof of it." He laid the parchment upon the table. Gasps circled the room. "Reginald's hand," Lady Eleanor murmured. "I'd know it anywhere." "The hollow hour strikes," Tuppence read aloud. "What does it mean to you, Lady Eleanor?" The widow shook her head, lips pursed. A melodramatic phrase like so many of his. "And to you, Henry?" Tommy asked. Henry scowled. "Nothing. Nonsense." "Perhaps nonsense enough to kill for," Tuppence said lightly. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Each guest shifted, uneasy, yet none dared speak further. As breakfast ended, the Beresfords withdrew once more to the hall. "We've set the cat among the pigeons," Tommy said. "One of them fears that phrase enough to creep about at night." Tuppence touched the folded scrap. "The hollow hour strikes. Whatever it means, Tommy, it frightens them. And that may prove the very key we need." The grandfather clock chimed 9, its deep notes vibrating through the stone walls. Tuppence shivered. The house felt alive again, but not with warmth, with menace. Somewhere in its draughty halls a murderer moved still, hunting the fragments of Sir Reginald's secret. And until the riddle was solved, Raven's Hollow would remain a stage set for treachery, where the next stroke of the hollow hour might toll for them all. The storm returned with grim persistence that afternoon, as though the skies themselves disapproved of the secrets festering within Raven's Hollow. Rain lashed the tall windows, distorting the view of the sodden gardens beyond. Thunder rumbled at intervals, low and heavy, shaking the glass in its casements. Inside, the atmosphere was worse. The guests moved like uneasy spirits, each waiting for accusation, each dreading discovery. It was into this tension that Tommy and Tuppence stepped, determined to tug at the threads until the entire web of lies revealed its pattern. They began with Henry Harwood. He was cornered in the billiards room, chalking a cue with unnecessary vigour, though the game itself lay forgotten. His eyes flickered at their arrival, defiance mixed with fear. "You've no right to badger me," he snapped. "The police will settle this, not amateurs." "Perhaps," Tommy said, leaning casually against the table. "But until then, we must endure each other. Tell me, Henry, how much do you owe?" The young man's grip tightened on the cue. "That's none of your business." "It becomes our business," Tuppence interjected, "when the amount owed might be enough to drive a man to desperation. Gambling debts, are they not?" His face blanched. "Who told you?" "No one," she said smoothly. "You told us just now, with your silence." He dropped the cue and turned away, his shoulders sagging. "I borrowed. Too much. Too often. Uncle knew. He threatened to cut me off entirely." "And so," Tommy said softly, "the ledger, the accounts, the black book. Your name perhaps among them. A motive, Henry, whether you admit it or not." Henry whirled. "I may be weak, but I am not a killer. If Uncle meant to ruin me, I'd have pleaded, not murdered. Believe that or not, it is the truth." They left him trembling, his protestations echoing hollowly in the storm. The secretary was next. Charles Linton had retreated to his small office where papers were stacked precariously high. His fingers twitched endlessly, shuffling documents that no longer required shuffling. "You forge a neat hand," Tommy remarked casually, closing the door behind them. The man jumped. "I beg your pardon?" "Letters," Tommy continued, his tone almost offhand. Sir Reginald hinted at it, a secretary who could imitate his master's hand, useful for correspondence, dangerous for temptation. Linton's face turned ashen. I copied signatures, yes, at Sir Reginald's command. He had me draft letters he preferred not to be linked with his name. It was for convenience only. Or for blackmail, Tuppence suggested. His mouth opened, then closed with a snap. Sweat beaded on his brow. He threatened me, said he'd expose me if I left his service. I was trapped. Another motive, Tommy said lightly. You see how they pile up? I didn't kill him, Linton cried. I swear it. I was afraid of him, yes, but I am no murderer. Yet his trembling hands betrayed him, and the smell of fear lingered as they departed. Lady Eleanor was found in the drawing-room, gazing at her reflection in a darkened window, cigarette smoke wreathing her face. She greeted them with a weary smile. You look as though you expect me to confess to something delicious, she said. I warn you, my life is a dreary thing. Widowhood leaves little to confess. Not according to Sir Reginald's ledger, Tuppence said quietly. There were entries suggesting money changed hands between you. £5,000. Care to explain? Lady Eleanor exhaled smoke, her eyes glittering. He lent me money. Yes, I admit it. My husband left me land, but no liquidity. I sold what jewels I could, but it was never enough. Reginald assisted, not without expectation of companionship. Tommy's voice was dry. And when companionship waned, her lips curved bitterly. He threatened to reveal the debt, to paint me as a schemer living on borrowed charm. My reputation would not have survived. And so, Tuppence pressed, you had cause to silence him. Eleanor laughed sharply. Cause, perhaps, but not courage. I endure humiliation better than prison. Yet her hands shook as she stubbed out the cigarette. The Reverend Pritchard awaited them in the chapel-like morning room, surrounded by books of sermons and accounts. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed with sleepless red. You wish to know about the fund, he said, before they could speak. Yes, I confess. There was a charitable account established for war widows. I borrowed from it. Temporarily, I thought. Sir Reginald discovered the shortfall. And threatened you? Tommy asked. The vicar's voice broke. He said he would expose me to the bishop. I should be ruined, cast out. I begged for time. He refused. My shame would have been total. So you too had motive, Tuppence said softly. He clasped his hands, knuckles white. I am a sinner, yes. Weak, but not a murderer. God help me, not that. The day wore on with each conversation tightening the noose of suspicion. Everywhere they turned they found lies half buried, truths reluctantly unearthed. The house seemed to shrink with every step, its corridors closing in, its candle-lit shadows pressing close. By evening, Tuppence felt the claustrophobia like a physical weight. The storm outside beat ceaselessly at the walls, trapping them within. Trust had eroded entirely. Each glance across the dinner table was loaded, each silence sharper than words. Later, alone with Tommy in the library, Tuppence spoke her thoughts aloud. They all had motive, each and every one. Henry, desperate for money. Linton, enslaved by forgery. Eleanor, caught in debts of her own. The vicar, tainted by scandal. Not one of them could survive exposure. Tommy nodded. But motive alone is not guilt. We must weigh who had opportunity, who had the nerve. That night, at midnight, while the clock stopped, one of them entered the study, perhaps more than one. She tilted her head. You think they may have colluded? Consider it, he said. Two conspirators could manage a locked room more easily than one to strike, the other to stage, and the ledger's destruction suggests desperation beyond a single hand. Tuppence shivered. A storm without, a storm within. It's as though the house itself conspires with them. Tommy's eyes hardened. Then we must tear through their web before it tightens around us. That night, the storm rose to a crescendo, lightning illuminating the manor in stark flashes, thunder rattling the beams. The guests retired early, but none slept soundly. Doors creaked, footsteps whispered, and more than one candle burned far into the night. Tuppence lay awake, the phrase still in her mind. The hollow hour strikes. She felt the truth edging nearer. dangerous and inevitable. Someone in the house had killed to bury their secret, perhaps more than one, and until the truth was unearthed, Raven's Hollow would remain a prison of shadows, its guests bound together in a web of motives too tangled to unravel, save by those determined to see justice through. The storm had quieted by morning, but the uneasy hush inside Raven's Hollow was worse than thunder. Breakfast passed in strained silence. Henry Harwood toyed with his eggs until they grew cold. Charles Linton dabbed endlessly at his spectacles. Lady Eleanor fanned herself, though the fire had dwindled, and the Reverend Pritchard mumbled grace over every sip of tea as if it might turn to poison in his mouth. Tommy and Tuppence exchanged glances over the silver pot of coffee. Every guest seemed hollow-eyed, frayed by sleepless nights and gnawed by suspicion. Yet beneath it all was a tension more volatile than grief: fear. By late afternoon, when the guests assembled in the drawing-room for a semblance of civility, that fear erupted. The drawing-room was a grand space, dominated by a crystal chandelier suspended above a circle of velvet chairs. Its facets caught what little light the day offered, scattering it into nervous shards. Lady Eleanor had claimed the best seat, arranging herself like a queen in exile, her bracelets jingling faintly as she gestured through a story no one truly listened to. Henry paced, muttering under his breath. Linton hovered near the window as though fresh air might absolve him. The vicar sat stiffly with his Bible unopened on his lap, eyes darting to each in turn. Tuppence felt the air crackle, brittle as thin glass. Then came the sound, a sharp twang, like a violin string snapping. She looked up. The chandelier lurched. With a groan of rope and iron, it dropped a foot, then another. Crystals clashed like swords, light fractured madly, and Lady Eleanor's shriek split the room. She leapt aside just as the chandelier crashed to the carpet, missing her chair by inches. The room dissolved into chaos. Henry swore violently. The vicar cried out in prayer. Linton dropped his spectacles, and Eleanor, pale as marble, clutched at Tuppence, trembling, or appearing to. "My God," Henry gasped. "It nearly killed her." Tommy was already at the point of fall, crouched over the rope that dangled from the ceiling. He examined the frayed end, his jaw hard. This, he declared, was no accident. The butler and two maids rushed in, faces pale with shock. The butler stammered apologies, insisting the chandelier had been inspected only last month. "Spare us," Tommy cut him off. "The rope's been cut. Look here, clean slice, then ragged edges to disguise it. Someone planned this." Gasps rippled through the group. Lady Eleanor, still clutching Tuppence, let out a moan. "It was meant for me," she cried. "First Reginald, now me. Someone hunts us one by one." Tuppence eased her into a chair. "Or perhaps," she said gently, "someone wished only to frighten. Panic can be as useful as death." Eleanor's eyes flashed. "You think I imagine it?" "I think," Tuppence said carefully, "that your fear seems a little too rehearsed." The widow stiffened, then turned her head away, hiding her face in a lace handkerchief. Panic spread like fire. The vicar wrung his hands, muttering about divine punishment. Linton protested that he had been at the far end of the room, too near-sighted to scheme with ropes. Henry accused him nonetheless, his voice rising until Tommy silenced them both. "Enough," he barked. "We'll get nowhere in this hysteria. The fact is plain. Someone attempted murder. Whether the target was Lady Eleanor, or whether she was merely convenient, remains to be seen." The butler, visibly shaken, asked if he should summon the police again. "They are already on their way," Tommy said. "But until they arrive, no one leaves this house. The killer is among us, and they are desperate." His words hung heavy in the air. Later, when the drawing-room had been cleared and the shattered chandelier carted away, Tuppence walked the corridor with Tommy. The scent of smoke and dust clung to her dress. "Did you see her trembling?" Tuppence asked. Tommy nodded. "Yes, and I saw how her eyes darted toward Henry before she fainted so prettily into your arms. Half her performance was for him." "She plays the victim too well," Tuppence murmured. "If she is guilty, then she sought sympathy. If innocent, she wished to redirect suspicion. In either case, she gains." "Unless," Tommy said grimly, "the cut rope was aimed at someone else entirely. Suppose another guest had taken that chair." They fell silent, the storm whispering at the windows as if echoing their unease. That evening, supper was a strained affair. The dining table had been reset with meticulous care, yet no amount of silver polish could remove the tremor from each guest's hand. Henry drank too quickly, his words slurred with defiance. "We're rats in a trap. My uncle's ghost laughs at us while we wait for the next rope to fall." "Steady on," Tommy said. "Ghosts don't cut ropes. People do." The vicar raised his eyes. "But desperation can drive men to evil. Perhaps more than one here conspires." Lady Eleanor dabbed her lips delicately. "Conspiracy? In this house? Really, Reverend, your imagination runs riot. If anyone wished me gone, I can assure you they shall have to try harder." Her bravado rang hollow. Tuppence watched the quick tremor of her fingers, the dart of her eyes toward Linton. Fear and calculation walked hand in hand. After the meal, Tommy inspected the chandelier's wreckage by lamplight. The rope, thick and strong, showed a single clean cut before the fibres had been unravelled roughly, as though to mimic wear. "No work of accident," he said. "A blade, sharp and decisive." "And a hand familiar with knots," Tuppence added, noting the tidy splicing of the remaining cord. "Which of them knows ropes so well?" "Henry, from his hunting trips. Or the vicar. Church bells demand rope work. Or even Linton, though I doubt he's the sort to climb ladders. Eleanor? No, she wouldn't risk breaking a nail." "Unless she wished us to think so," Tuppence said softly. The night deepened. The manor's guests withdrew in brittle silence, each afraid, each suspicious. Tuppence lingered by the staircase, gazing upward at the empty space where the chandelier had hung. "Second attempt, Tommy," she whispered. "The killer grows reckless, and when they grow reckless, they grow dangerous." Tommy joined her, his hand resting briefly on hers. "Then we must stay sharper still, before the third attempt finds its mark." The storm gathered again after midnight, wind rattling shutters, rain tapping at the panes like insistent fingers. In her chamber, Tuppence sat awake long after Tommy had drifted to a light, restless sleep. She could not shake the image of the rope, sliced clean, swaying above Lady Eleanor's chair. She pictured each suspect's hands upon the blade. Henry's desperate, Linton's trembling, Eleanor's jewelled fingers, the vicar's ink-stained ones. Which hand had sought to guide the chandelier's fall? At last she rose and paced to the window. Below, the lawns gleamed wet, the statues ghostly in the rain. Somewhere in the depths of Raven's Hollow, she felt, the killer smiled at their confusion. But confusion could not last forever. Morning came grey and exhausted. The servants whispered of leaving, but the butler hushed them firmly. Though his own face was drawn, none dared cross the gates. Fear held them bound. Over breakfast, Tommy announced his conclusion. "The rope was cut. That much is fact. Therefore we must treat it as an attempted murder. Until the police arrive, we are all under suspicion. No one moves about unaccompanied, and every room will be searched again." Henry slammed his fist on the table. "We're prisoners, then? To sit and wait while one of us sharpens the next knife?" "You may call it prison," Tommy said, "but I call it survival." Later that day, Lady Eleanor reappeared in full regalia, jewels glittering despite the dim light. She carried herself with haughty composure, though her pallor betrayed her. "I refuse to be cowed," she declared. "If someone means to kill me, they had their chance and failed. I intend to go on living, and I expect champagne with supper." Her bravado rang through the hall, yet Tuppence, standing nearby, caught the subtle quiver of her lips. The fear was real, but so too was the performance. "She trembles," Tuppence murmured to Tommy afterward. "But not quite enough." "Then either she was truly the target," Tommy replied, "or she wants us to believe it. And until we know which, we can trust nothing." That evening, when the lamps were lit and the storm rumbled once more beyond the windows, Tuppence felt the change in the air. Suspicion had turned to dread. The guests spoke little, their glances sharp, their silences sharper still. The house was no longer merely a stage for secrets. It had become a battlefield, one in which fear itself was the deadliest weapon. And somewhere in its shadowed halls the killer waited, desperate enough to strike again. The storm had slackened by morning, leaving the grounds of Raven's Hollow shrouded in mist. It curled across the lawns and pressed its damp breath against the high windows, dimming the light that tried weakly to penetrate the house. Yet inside the east wing, where the air was chill and the corridors seldom trodden, the gloom was thicker still. Tuppence, restless by nature, had insisted on exploring. Answers, she told Tommy, rarely fall into one's lap while sitting at the hearth. They prefer to lurk in draughty passages and forgotten corners. So it was that she moved along the eastern corridor, her hand brushing faded tapestries. The walls smelled of mildew, the air heavy with neglect. The wing had been shut for years, she recalled the butler saying, ever since the late Lady Harwood's decline. It was then she noticed it, a ripple in the tapestry that did not belong to any stirring of air. Pressing closer, she saw a faint line where the fabric bulged from the wall. She tugged carefully, and the tapestry shifted, revealing a narrow seam of wood, a hidden door almost imperceptible. Her heart quickened. "Tommy!" she hissed. He came at once, his torch in hand, eyebrows raised at her discovery. Together they pressed the concealed latch. With a reluctant groan, the panel swung inward. The chamber beyond was small, windowless, and thick with dust. Yet it was no mere storage room. Against one wall stood a heavy iron chest, its surface scarred by age. Around it were stacked boxes of files, their covers marked with wartime dates, 1940, 1941, 1942. The air smelled of paper and iron, of secrets locked too long in darkness. Tuppence moved to the files, lifting the lid of the nearest box. Inside were military reports, coded messages, correspondence stamped confidential. Her hand trembled as she drew one out. Names leapt from the page, names of officials, businessmen, officers. "Wartime records," she whispered. "Reginald kept them here, hidden." Tommy crouched by the chest. A brass plate bore the initials R.H. The lock resisted at first, but with a firm twist of his old army knife, the mechanism yielded with a snap. The lid rose, heavy and reluctant, as though it did not wish to give up its contents. Inside lay folders bound in string, a ledger wrapped in oilskin, and beneath them a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. Tommy lifted one folder and opened it. His face hardened. "Proof," he said grimly. "Proof of treachery." Tuppence bent beside him. The folder contained intercepted communiques, messages to enemy agents, reports of shipments deliberately misdirected, supplies vanished. And at the bottom, a document in Reginald's bold hand, outlining his suspicion of one particular collaborator. Her eyes widened. A name. "Here, Tommy. Look." He read aloud, his voice low. "Charles Linton, Secretary to Sir Reginald Harwood. Compromised correspondence, suspected leaks, association with known sympathizers, recommendation, surveillance, and eventual exposure." The papers shook faintly in his hands. "Good Lord, Tuppence. It wasn't money, or inheritance, or debts. The true motive is here. Reginald meant to expose a traitor, and that traitor struck first," she swallowed. "Then Linton, not merely resentful, not merely trapped, a man facing ruin and disgrace." The chamber seemed to close in around them, heavy with betrayal. The air was thick, suffocating. Tuppence replaced the papers, her mind racing. If this is true, then every action since, the burning of the ledger, the midnight intruder, the chandelier, all of it stems from fear of exposure. Someone desperate to erase their name from Reginald's hand. "Desperate enough to kill twice," Tommy said. They returned to the hall with the folder hidden beneath Tommy's coat. The house seemed alive with whispers. In the drawing room, Henry argued hotly with Lady Eleanor, while the vicar tried and failed to soothe them. Linton sat apart, his face pale, his eyes darting whenever voices rose. Tommy laid the folder on the table. "Here," he said. "Reginald kept records, not of debts alone, but of betrayal. Wartime betrayal. One among you is marked as a traitor." The room froze. Linton's hands clutched at his knees. "This is madness. Lies. Reginald was bitter. He invented enemies." Tuppence's gaze was steady. "The evidence is in his own hand. Reports, documents, letters. He knew too much, and he was silenced for it." Lady Eleanor gave a brittle laugh. "How dramatic! Shall we all be accused now of espionage?" "Not all," Tommy said. "Only one, and we intend to discover who." The storm had gathered once more by evening. The lamps burned low in the hall, their light flickering as the wind pressed at the shutters. Shadows clung to the corners. The house felt claustrophobic, charged with danger. The guests had retreated to their chambers, but suspicion kept them restless. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind, seemed to carry menace. Tommy and Tuppence sat in the library, the folder spread before them. "Linton seems obvious," Tuppence murmured. "Too obvious. What if Reginald's suspicion fell short of proof? What if another, fearing discovery, planted his name to divert blame?" Tommy nodded. "A possibility. Henry's debts, Eleanor's secrets, the vicar's fund, all could mask deeper treachery. Yet the documents point squarely at Linton." They fell silent, the fire crackling low. Then the lights flickered, once, twice, and died. Darkness swallowed the house. Gasps echoed from the corridor. Footsteps hurried. A maid screamed. "Stay here," Tommy ordered, rising at once. Tuppence followed, clutching a candle she managed to light. The hall was chaos. Servants rushed about with matches, the guests called out in confusion. Then, from the far end of the east wing came the sound. A shot. Sharp. Echoing. Final. The cry that followed chilled them to the bone. They ran toward it, the candle flame quivering in Tuppence's hand. The east corridor yawned ahead, black as pitch. At the far end a door hung ajar. They pushed inside. On the floor lay the Reverend Pritchard, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. His Bible lay fallen beside him. Henry stood frozen, eyes wide, while Lady Eleanor pressed a handkerchief to her lips. Linton hovered near the door, trembling violently. "He's been shot," Eleanor cried. Tommy knelt beside the vicar. "Easy now. It's a flesh wound. You'll live. Who fired?" The vicar groaned. "A figure. Dark. Before the lights failed. I heard the step. Turned. Then pain." He sagged back, faint with loss of blood. Tuppence looked around sharply. The window was open, the curtains thrashing in the wind. "The shooter escaped," she said. "Used the blackout to mask it." Henry swore. "This is madness. We'll all be corpses before the night is out." Linton pressed his hands to his face. "It wasn't me, I swear it. I heard the shot. I came running like the rest." But his voice shook, and his denial sounded too much like a plea. The butler and 2 servants arrived with lamps, their faces stark with fear. They carried the vicar to his chamber, binding his wound as best they could. The others huddled in the hall, suspicion sharper than ever. Tommy stood tall, his expression grim. "This proves what we already knew. Someone here is desperate, reckless. They've tried fire, falling chandeliers, now bullets. The closer we come to the truth, the more they strike." Tuppence held up the torn parchment they had recovered days before. "The hollow hour strikes." "And now it has," she said softly, "at the very hour of darkness." The group shuddered. Shadows leapt as the lamps flickered. Fear thickened like fog. When at last the household dispersed, uneasy and sleepless, Tommy and Tuppence returned to the library. Tommy closed the folder firmly. "It's no longer about debts or inheritance. The heart of this lies in treachery. Reginald meant to reveal it, and he died. The vicar was shot tonight because we drew too close. The killer hunts in the dark, but their desperation betrays them." Tuppence gazed into the fire, her face pale but resolute. "And until we unmask them, none of us are safe." The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as though mocking them. Ravenshollow crouched in shadow, its secrets pressing ever tighter as the web of betrayal drew taut around them all. And in the darkness beyond the door, someone listened. The storm had returned with furious grandeur, as though the heavens themselves demanded judgment. Rain lashed the high windows of Ravenshollow. Thunder rolled like a drumbeat of doom, and lightning cracked across the night sky, illuminating the great hall in fits of stark brilliance. It was close to midnight when Tommy and Tuppence Beresford gathered everyone there. The fire had been coaxed into a blaze, but its warmth did nothing to soften the tension. Shadows crouched in every corner, dancing and leaping whenever the lightning flared. The guests assembled reluctantly. Henry Harwood, his face gaunt and pale, nursed a glass of brandy with trembling hands. Lady Eleanor swept in with defiance, jewels flashing, lips set tight. Charles Linton clutched his spectacles like a shield, blinking nervously. The Reverend Pritchard, his shoulder bandaged from the shot that had grazed him, sat hunched, eyes hollow with pain and guilt. Even the servants hovered at the edges, fear pinning them to their stations. Tuppence's clear voice broke the silence. Sir Reginald Harwood was not a man without enemies. His ledger was full of secrets, debts, betrayals, compromises. But it was not money or family disputes that cost him his life. It was truth. He uncovered a traitor, and for that he was silenced. Murmurs rippled through the hall. Linton raised a shaking hand. "You've no proof. No proof it was me." Tommy stepped forward, his voice steady. "You'll note, Mr. Linton, that we did not name you, but your haste to deny is curious." Linton faltered, his mouth opening and closing without words. Tommy continued, his eyes sweeping the room. There were 3 key details that revealed the truth to us. The first, the stopped clock in Reginald's study. It had been halted at midnight, suggesting the moment of death. But the ink on the torn document was still wet when we entered that room at dawn. Reginald must have died nearer to 1 o'clock, and the clock was deliberately altered to mislead. Lady Eleanor lifted her chin. "That proves nothing. Anyone could have tampered with a clock." "Indeed," Tuppence said. "But not everyone was awake at that hour. Only those we know wandered the halls in the dark." Her gaze shifted pointedly. Henry swallowed hard. Eleanor stiffened. Linton looked away. "The second detail," Tommy pressed on, "was the pistol. It was found in Reginald's left hand, but Sir Reginald was right-handed. That pistol was placed there clumsily by someone who didn't notice or didn't care to notice the difference." The vicar whispered, "Dear God." "And the third," Tuppence added softly, "was the black book itself, half-burned yet not wholly destroyed. Enough remained to point toward wartime treachery. The killer wasn't trying to erase debts, but to obliterate proof of betrayal. That is why the intruder searched the library, why the chandelier fell, why bullets flew in the dark. One of you feared exposure as a traitor to this country." Lightning flared. For a moment the hall blazed like a cathedral, every face stark, unmasked by shadow. Tommy drew the oilskin-wrapped folder from beneath his arm and laid it upon the long oak table. Reginald left this, reports, letters, evidence enough to hang a man, and within it, he paused, opening the folder, letting the rustle of papers echo through the hall, is proof of who that man is. All eyes strained forward. Henry's glass shattered in his grip. Eleanor clutched her pearls. Linton whimpered. The vicar closed his eyes as though praying for blindness. Tuppence leaned forward, her gaze fixed upon one face. "You," she said clearly. "It was you." Charles Linton staggered back. His spectacles slipped from his nose, clattering to the stone floor. "No, no, it's a lie. Reginald invented it. He hated me. He sought to ruin me." Tommy's voice was steel. "Reginald trusted you as his secretary. You controlled his correspondence. You forged his hand. You had access to every private paper. During the war, you betrayed shipments, leaked reports. You profited while others suffered. Reginald discovered it, and he meant to expose you, so you silenced him." The secretary shook his head wildly. No, I only copied what he asked. You staged the study," Tuppence said firmly. "You halted the clock, placed the pistol in his left hand. You hoped it would look like suicide, but you overlooked the ink still wet. You overlooked Reginald's dominant hand, and when the ledger survived the fire, you risked everything to destroy it. The intruder in the library, the cut rope, the shot in the dark, all your desperate attempts to finish what you began." Linton's face crumpled, his hands clawing at the air. "You can't prove it. Words, suspicions, they're nothing without proof." Tommy opened the folder again, pulling free a single letter. "But we do have proof. This is a coded communique, intercepted, decrypted. And on the margin, your handwriting. Cross-references you thought private. Reginald kept it. He knew." Silence followed. The only sound was the storm outside, rattling the windows like a furious audience. Then Linton broke. His knees buckled, his voice cracked. "Yes," he cried. "Yes, I did it. Do you know what it is to be trapped, to serve a man who holds your life in his hands? He would have ruined me, dragged me before the courts as a traitor. I could not let that happen. So I acted. I acted to survive." His confession hung in the air, raw and ugly. Lady Eleanor recoiled. Henry muttered a curse. The vicar clutched his bandaged shoulder, whispering a prayer for mercy. But the moment did not end there. With sudden fury, Linton lunged toward the folder on the table. "Then I'll finish it now. No one will see these papers again." He seized the bundle, flinging it toward the fire. Pages scattered, some catching flame. "Stop him!" Tuppence cried. Tommy sprang forward, grappling with the secretary. They struggled, crashing against the table. A candlestick toppled, sparks flying. The servants shrieked. Henry leapt to assist, but too late. Linton had drawn a knife from his coat, blade flashing in the firelight. The struggle was desperate. Linton slashed wildly, his face contorted with terror. Tommy held his wrist, straining against the strength born of panic. "Traitor!" Henry roared, rushing forward. He seized Linton's arm, twisting it. The knife clattered to the stone floor, but Linton, snarling, broke free, his eyes blazing with madness. "You'll never cage me!" He bolted toward the door. Lightning split the sky, thunder crashed, and in that moment the butler stepped forward, blocking his path. "You'll not pass," the old servant said firmly, arms spread wide. Linton hesitated, cornered, his chest heaving. His gaze darted about, seeking escape. There was none. At last he sank to his knees, his face collapsing into despair. "It was the war," he whispered. "The war ruined us all. I only wanted to live." Tommy straightened, his breath ragged, the knife kicked safely aside. "And for that, you destroyed others. For that, you killed Reginald Harwood." The hall echoed with silence once more, broken only by the steady beat of rain upon the stone. When the police arrived an hour later, Linton was taken into custody, his confession signed, his evidence gathered. The servants watched with grim relief as he was led away, his face hollow, his steps faltering. Henry poured another brandy with shaking hands. Lady Eleanor collapsed into a chair, murmuring that she needed air, jewels rattling at her throat. The vicar bowed his head, whispering prayers for both the dead and the damned. Tommy and Tuppence stood together by the fire, watching the flames devour the last of Linton's scattered pages. "So ends the hollow hour," Tuppence said softly. Tommy nodded. "And with it, Reginald's secret. He meant to unmask a traitor, and in the end justice has done so for him." Lightning flared once more, but now it seemed less threatening, a curtain call rather than a warning. The storm was passing, the dawn not far behind. Tuppence slipped her hand into Tommy's. "Another war may be fought on battlefields, Tommy, but this one, this war of secrets, was fought here, in shadows, and tonight the shadows lost." He squeezed her hand gently. "Come, partner, we've done our part. Let the morning bring peace to Raven's Hollow." The grandfather clock in the hall, long silent, told the hour. Midnight had passed. The hollow hour had struck, and its echoes would linger forever in the stones of Raven's Hollow. Dawn crept slowly across the sky, a pale wash of rose and silver spilling over the wet lawns of Raven's Hollow. The storm had exhausted itself at last, leaving behind the clean scent of rain and the fragile promise of morning. Mist clung to the hedges, and the old stone manor, so menacing by candlelight, seemed subdued, almost ordinary, in the first light of day. Inside, the great hall bore the aftermath of a sleepless night. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, the velvet chairs were pulled askew, and the air carried the tired hush of people who had shouted, feared, and confessed until their voices were raw. Charles Linton sat slumped between two constables, wrists bound, his spectacles hanging askew. The confession of a desperate man still rang in the ears of those who had heard it, shattering in its blunt truth, pitiful in its justification. The servants watched in silence, some with pity, others with quiet fury. The inspector in charge, a stout man with sharp eyes, finished reviewing the folder Tommy had handed over. He closed it with a deliberate snap. "You've saved us no small amount of trouble, Mr. and Mrs. Beresford," he said gravely. "The evidence is damning, and his confession seals it. Linton will stand trial. Betrayal in wartime, murder in peacetime. It will not go lightly with him." Linton groaned, burying his face in his hands, his voice cracked. "You don't understand. He would have ruined me. I only wanted to live." The inspector's eyes hardened. "And in seeking your life, you destroyed another's. The law will answer you now." He gestured, and the constables led Linton away. Silence followed, broken only by the creak of boots on stone and the distant caw of a crow outside. Lady Eleanor sank into a chair, her jewels glinting dully in the thin light. She looked older, diminished, as though the night had stripped her of artifice. "So, it's finished," she whispered. "Reginald's ghost can rest, and we— what are we now? Survivors of a play too grim for the stage." Henry, still pale, muttered bitterly, "Survivors, yes. Though my uncle's fortune is ashes, his secret's charred, and my name dragged through the mire." He downed another brandy, his hand unsteady. The Reverend Pritchard, bandaged and pale, raised his eyes heavenward. "May God have mercy on us all. We have each borne our shame." Perhaps that was Reginald's last design, to strip us bare before judgment. No one answered him. His words seemed too heavy for the hour. Tommy and Tuppence stepped outside together, leaving the others to their exhaustion. The dawn air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of earth and the faint sweetness of wet grass. The lawns stretched pale under the mist, statues glistening with droplets. The hollows that had felt so ominous under storm and shadow were softened by daylight. Even Raven's Hollow itself seemed weary, its menace dissolved into stone and ivy. Tuppence breathed deeply. Strange, isn't it? By night this house was a fortress of secrets. Now, in the morning, it's only a house again. The shadows seem almost imaginary. Tommy glanced at her with a wry smile. "Imaginary or not, they nearly dropped a chandelier on your head and shot a vicar in the dark. I'd say the shadows did their share of damage." She laughed softly, though her eyes were thoughtful. "It's always the same, isn't it? A house full of people who smile by day and plot by night. Trust is so fragile, Tommy. A ledger, a letter, a single whispered secret, any of it can tear lives apart." "Which is why," he replied dryly, "we ought to think twice before accepting another midnight invitation. I prefer my mysteries with fewer collapsing chandeliers." Tuppence slipped her arm through his. "Oh, but where would be the fun in that? Admit it, you'd be bored to death with peace and quiet." He chuckled. "Possibly, but I'd risk boredom for the luxury of one night's sleep without pistol shots in the corridor." They walked slowly along the gravel path, the crunch of their steps mingling with birdsong just beginning to wake in the hedgerows. Tuppence paused to gaze back at the manor. "It feels almost indecent," she said softly, "to see it so calm after such ugliness, as though nothing happened at all." "Something always happens," Tommy said, "but houses endure. It's the people who break." Her expression softened. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "And yet, somehow we never do. We've seen so much darkness, Tommy, but here we are, still standing, still together." He squeezed her hand. "That, Tuppence, is the only mystery I'm content never to solve." By mid-morning, the police had gone, the constable's cart rolling away down the wet drive with Linton inside. The remaining guests gathered their belongings with trembling hands, desperate to leave Raven's Hollow behind. Lady Eleanor departed with her head high but her eyes hollow. Henry stumbled away, muttering about debts and ruined futures. The vicar lingered longest, pressing Tuppence's hand with a fervent grip. "Pray for me," he whispered, before retreating into the mist. At last the house was still. The servants moved quietly, clearing the remnants of the storm, shutting windows, sweeping shards of glass from the drawing-room floor. The echoes of fear seemed to fade with every stroke of the broom. Tommy and Tuppence stood in the great hall once more, their bags at their feet. The grandfather clock ticked steadily, its silence broken at last. Tuppence looked up at it. "The hollow hour has struck and passed." Tommy nodded. "And Raven's Hollow will live on, just another old house in the countryside," she smiled faintly, "until the next secret stirs its stones." As they stepped out into the pale sunshine, Tommy offered her his hand. "Well, partner," he said, "another case closed, another storm weathered. What say you to a proper breakfast somewhere with hot coffee and no ghosts?" Tuppence laughed, her voice light against the morning air. "I say yes, with one condition." "And what's that?" "That you don't grumble when the next invitation arrives, because it will, Tommy. It always does." He groaned theatrically. "Remind me again why I married you." "Because," she said, eyes twinkling, "I make life interesting." He squeezed her hand, smiling despite himself. "That you do, Tuppence. That you do." Together they walked down the drive, the mist parting before them, the manor receding into silence. The storm had passed, the dawn was clear, and for now at least the world was theirs again.